Okay, 7 o'clock. Let's wait till we have at least one person. Click that so my laptop doesn't sound like it's about to take off. Hello! Hello, thank you for tuning in for our next class in Leviticus. How's everybody doing this evening? Good to see you, Bobby. Good to see you. We are going to be in Leviticus chapter 21. We have passed the halfway mark a couple of weeks ago, and now we're in, it's close to the second to last section of Leviticus. Just to give us a good feeling of where we are in the structure of the book, we had the first rundown of topics in the beginning of the book, which was first having to do with rituals, like sacrifices, the sacrificial system, and then talking about the priesthood and ordaining the priests and what they were supposed to wear and such. And also the incident with Nadab and Abihu. And then it had, we would call them, I guess, purity laws, holiness laws. And then we had the central focal point of the book, which was about the Day of Atonement. And then we had more purity laws. And now we are on the second section that has to do with the priesthood. And so next week we're going to explore the section that has to do with rituals again, but these rituals are going to be feast days or festival days. And there is going to be some very interesting things that we learn about these festival days. But before we can get to that, let's look at Leviticus 21 and 22. So what we learn from these chapters is that the priests were held to a very high standard of morality and holiness. Particularly holiness is what this gets into. Moses, or the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the priests, the son of Aaron, and say to them, no one shall make himself unclean for the dead among his people, except for his closest relatives, his mother, his father, his son, his daughter, his brother, or his virgin sister." That would be an unmarried sister. "He shall not make himself unclean as a husband among his people and so profane himself. They shall not make bald patches on their heads, nor shave off the edges of their beards, nor make any cuts on their body. They shall be holy to their God and not profane the name of their God. For they offer the Lord's food offerings, the bread of their God, and therefore they shall be holy. They shall not marry a prostitute or a woman who has been defiled, neither shall they marry a woman who's divorced from her husband. For the priest is holy to his God. You shall sanctify him, for he offers the bread of your God. He shall be holy to you, for I, the Lord, who sanctify you, am holy. The daughter of any priest, if she profanes herself by harlotry, profanes her father, shall be burned with fire." Yikes, that last part is pretty strict. But here we have a holiness standard that is a higher standard than the rest of the people of Israel, and this is given specifically to the priests. We see that the only dead people that they were allowed to touch was their close relatives, and that does not extend beyond their parents and siblings. So cousins, the priest cannot attend to their cousin's burial. Once again, to touch a dead body is to touch something that is connected to death, right? Because a dead thing. And death is the consequence of sin entering the world from Genesis chapter 3, and therefore it is contrary to the holiness of God. It's not allowed to exist within God's presence. Anything connected to death isn't allowed to exist within God's presence. And so, the priests are supposed to keep themselves from being made unclean as much as possible. And that means they were not allowed to touch a dead body, and that includes burying a dead body, if it was anyone beyond their immediate family. My hair is getting weird. If it was anyone beyond their immediate family. They also were not to ceremonially shave themselves or cut themselves. And this has two things that go along with it. One is the symbolism of losing a part of yourself. It is connected in a way to death, the same way that having a discharge, say, of blood or of mucus was connected to death symbolically, and therefore it would render you unclean. Ceremonially shaving was also considered to make oneself unclean, and to bleed. To bleed is to have a discharge of blood. Blood is coming out of your body, so to bleed would render you ceremonially unclean as well. So the priests were to avoid doing that. But the second reason why they were to avoid doing these particular things, ceremonially shaving themselves and cutting themselves, is because these were common pagan practices. We know for a fact that the priests in Egypt shaved themselves at least weekly, like shaved all the hair off their body, so they would not have any hair on their head. They wouldn't even have eyebrows, and that was to make sure that they did not carry any parasites, any lice or anything like that in their hair. Because if you don't have hair, you can't carry those in your hair. Because in their in their system of religion, those kind of parasites, if they were to enter the temples, they would defile the temples. So they shaved themselves. God said, "Don't shave yourselves. Don't do the ceremonial shaving." One, they washed themselves regularly. The Israelites did, so that wouldn't really be an issue. But these little animals, they wouldn't defile the tabernacle. That's not what the tabernacle is about. The tabernacle is about the presence of God, and the presence of God isn't defiled by lice. It's defiled by unholy things. And the practice of cutting oneself as an act of worship, sort of thing, is again very common in the pagan world. If you remember, I think it's 1 Kings 17 is not first. Yeah, 1 Kings. 1 Kings 17 is where Elijah confronts the. Sorry, 1 Kings 18. It's where Elijah confronts the prophets of Baal on the top of Mount Carmel, and they have the contest where they set an offering on the altar, but they're not allowed to put any fire to it because the real God would prove their realness by sending the fire down themselves to light the offering on fire. And so the prophets of Baal, they did their thing from morning till evening, and the Bible remarks that they were cutting themselves, and their blood was just flowing out because they were trying to implore to Baal to prove his realness, which of course he wasn't real, so that never happened. He never proved it because he can't. But also, the priests could not marry a woman who had already known another man. And that encompasses all the relations that could happen, even ones that were not consensual. It's that one is not so much a matter of the well, I guess it is to an extent the matter of the purity of the wife, but it was really about the matter of the symbolic purity of that relationship and that action. But also, their daughters, the priest's daughters, were to maintain their purity, and it was way more strict of an expectation than for a regular Israelite's daughter. If you were the daughter of a priest, right here it says it, verse 9, if you were to profane yourself by harlotry, then you profane your father, and there are serious consequences. Burning with fire. That is pretty big. So even the priest's family was held to a higher standard than a regular Israelite family. And this is actually very different from priests in the pagan world. Priests in the pagan world, with considered Egyptian priests or Greek priests, or they were commonly allowed to engage in activities that the moral code that they proclaimed to hold themselves to would condemn those things, but they were still allowed to do them because of the high social strata that they were a part of. However, in the law of Moses, the priests were by no means allowed to engage in those things. It would be the sentence would be death. And so there's a huge difference, and there's a huge constraint that comes upon a person if they were a member of the priesthood. And this is only the sort of ceremonial kind of constraint. Priests also were not allowed to own land. And owning land was one of the primary ways that you could accrue wealth. Priests couldn't own land. In fact, no Levite could own land. They strictly lived in the cities. So they could not accrue great wealth for themselves. That was in contrast to the pagan priests in the nations around them and around the world at the time. They could own land, and they were very often filthy, stinking rich. But the Israelite priests were not. They were not allowed to be powerful, and they were not allowed to have free reign over their sort of behavior. They were held to a very high standard. And when we get onto the chief priest or the high priest, verse 10, the priest who is chief among his brothers, on whose head is the anointing oil poured, and who has been consecrated to wear the garments, shall not let the hair of his head hang loose or tear his clothes. He shall not go in to any dead bodies, nor make himself unclean, even for his father and his mother. Not even for his father or his mother. He shall not go out of the sanctuary, lest he profane the sanctuary of his God. For the consecration of the anointing oil of his God is on him. I am the Lord. So that is about mourning. The high priest could by no means, and by no means, touch a dead body. Not even for his father or his mother. Not even for his parents. And your parents would be like, if you were to see to the preparation of any dead body, your parents, your father and your mother, would be on the top of that list. So if you can't even do that, if you're not even allowed to do that, you are not allowed to touch any dead body at all. They were to maintain the very strictest holiness in that regard. Purity, we'll put it that way. They could by no means touch a dead body, not even if that dead person was their father or their mother. And they could not leave the sanctuary. That doesn't mean they weren't allowed to leave ever, but it's in the context of their father or their mother having died. If they are in the middle of offering the sacrifices, and it is brought to their attention, the news, high priest, your mother passed away. They are not allowed to just leave. That they have to stay there. They have to finish. They have to get it done. If you go back and you look in Leviticus chapter 10, when Nadab and Abihu were burnt up before the Lord, what did God tell Aaron? Don't mourn for them. Don't take them out. Don't bury them. You need to finish this ceremony. You need to finish this priestly rite that you are doing right now, the sacrifices. You can't let that interrupt you. Do you remember what Jesus said about burying the dead? He called someone and the person said, I have to go bury my, I can't remember if he said father or mother, but I have to go bury my recently late father or mother. And Jesus said, let the dead bury their own dead. You follow me. That's pretty heavy. That's pretty radical sounding. But this is along the same lines. If you were the high priest and you were in this process of the sacrificial offerings, and someone says, high priest, your mother just died, you are not leaving. You are finishing this job. You're finishing this process. And if you did leave, you would be profaning the sanctuary of God. Then it says, verse 13, he shall take a wife in her virginity, a widow or a divorced woman, or a woman who has been defiled, or a prostitute. These he shall not marry. Again, just same like the other priest, he could not marry a woman who has known a man before. But he shall take as his wife a virgin of his own people. That wasn't specified with the other priests. Of his own people, that he may not profane his offspring among his people, for I am the Lord who sanctifies him. So the high priest here has another little thing that constrains him. He could not marry a woman who is not a virgin, but also his wife has to be of the Aaronic family. It couldn't just be any other Levite. John the Baptizer's father, Zechariah, it specifies that he was a Levite and he married a daughter of a Levite. So he married another Levite. That's fine. A priest marrying a Levite of any Levite family, that's fine. But a high priest, if you were to be a high priest or you hoped to be a high priest, you're not marrying just a Levite woman. You're marrying a woman who was born into the family of Aaron. And so the high priesthood is always someone descended from Aaron, and there's no muddying of the bloodline there. There's no muddying of the family relationship to Aaron. You would always be sure that high priest is a descendant of Aaron, and therefore they have a right to be a candidate for the high priesthood. Interesting thing, right? But also, moving on from that, the Lord said to Moses, saying, speak to Aaron, saying, none of your offspring throughout their generations who has a blemish may approach to offer the bread of God. For no one who has a blemish shall draw near, a blind man, or a lame man, or one who has a mutilated face, or a limb that's too long, or a man who has an injured foot or an injured hand, or a hunchback, or a dwarf, or a man who has a defect in his sight, or an itching disease, or scabs, or crushed testicles, no man of the offspring of Aaron, the priest, who has a blemish, shall come near to offer the Lord's food offerings. Since he has a blemish, he shall not come near to offer the bread of God. He may eat the bread of God, of his God, but of the most holy and the holy things, he shall not go through the veil or approach the altar, because he has a blemish, that he may not profane my sanctuaries, for I am the Lord who sanctifies them. So Moses spoke to Aaron and to his sons and to the people of Israel. So, essentially, no one with a blemish could serve as high priest. This essentially means any kind of deformity or disease, ongoing disease. Now, this isn't in a spirit of discrimination. Get that in your head. This is not in a spirit of discrimination. There is symbolism attached to deformities. Again, it's a consequence of sin being in the world. And the implication is, if Adam and Eve had never sinned, then, or if humanity had never sinned, then these problems, these ways that humans' bodies are messed up in some way, one way or another, wouldn't exist. It's a consequence of sin being in the world, just like how death was a consequence of sin being in the world. And as such, it cannot be allowed in the presence of God, as per the law of Moses. They could still minister in the tabernacle, they could still be priests, they could still be a part of the priesthood, but there were some things that they were not allowed to touch, and they were not allowed to do. They could not be the high priest. They could not go beyond the veil because of the blemish, the deformity. It's big on the symbolism, The holiness of God is important, and it is serious. And so even though it would maybe offend some people's sensibilities that people with deformities weren't allowed to take part in this particular aspect of the ministry, that wasn't the primary concern. Their sensibilities were not the primary concern. It was whether or not they were to be allowed into the holy presence of God with, this existing condition in their lives. And the answer was no, they're not. The holiness of God demanded that they not. And then as we move on to chapter 22, I want to get done in this class period. So we're going to go faster. No one in an unclean state could serve as a priest. This is from verses 1 through 9, and this just makes sense. I mean, we've already seen this, the idea of being unclean in Leviticus already, and it just makes sense and points to why all of these restrictions exist for the priesthood. The priest was the mediator between God and the people. So they have to be in the presence of God to do their job, and especially the high priest, right? Because he goes beyond the veil in front of the ark, in front of the mercy seat on top of the ark, where God said, I'll meet you there. My presence will be there. The priests have to be in the presence of God to do their job. And so they have to be extra careful to avoid being unclean, if, to the farthest extent that they can control. Avoid being unclean. Because if you're unclean, you can't just go into the presence of God. This is what Leviticus has already established. It is dangerous, right? It's dangerous and inappropriate to be in an unclean state and go into the presence of God like that. Again, to be unclean in itself is not a sin. it was, as long as you didn't, didn't make that egregious overstepping of boundaries of going into the presence of God while you're in an unclean state, then the matter of uncleanness is solved by, you know, at the very most extent, going through an intense cleaning procedure. But at the very least, it was just, hey, separate yourself from everyone else for an amount of days, and then when you're done, come and make the proper sacrifices, and you're good. You're just back to normal. So being in an unclean state is not a sin, but to be in an unclean state and just go into the presence of the holy God at his altar and in front of the mercy seat, even that is inappropriate, and that is what results in the sort of Nadab and Abihu and Ananias and Sapphira kind of things happening. Um, God's holiness, being God's holiness, results in the destruction of that which is unholy, of that which is unclean in his presence. Verses 10 through 16 point out that lay people, meaning people who were not of the priesthood and not of the priests' households, were not allowed to eat of the holy things. They're not allowed to eat a holy thing. What is a holy thing? Well, there are 2-3-ish holy food items. One is the bread of the presence, which definitely lay people aren't allowed to eat that. They're not even allowed to go in there. They're not even allowed to go in where it is, so they're not allowed to eat it. And of course, there's the instance where David is on the run from Saul in 1 Samuel, and he eats the bread of the presence because his men were starving, and the priest gave it to them. And Jesus later points out, he wasn't supposed to do that, and that was wrong, but he did it anyway, and people don't hold that against him for some reason. So why do you hold it against us if we're watering through a grain field on the Sabbath day and we happen to pluck a few ears of grain to have a snack? He's pointing out the hypocrisy of the people who were holding that against his disciples, because David ate the bread of the presence, and that is way inappropriate because he's not a priest, so he's not supposed to do that. But also, a holy thing, a holy food item would be let's call it the donated portion of the offerings. You remember some of the offerings had portions that were the memorial portion. They were burned on the altar. But then there was another portion that was not burned. And in some instances, like with the peace offering, the worshiper would eat a portion of the not burned portion, but the other portion would go to the priest who was offering that offering. And if it was a grain offering, then the memorial portion was burned, but the rest of it was to be given to the priest. So it was we'll call it the donated portion. This donated portion was eaten by the priests and by their households, their wife and their kids. So those are only for the priest and their households. The Bible specifies exactly who is involved, who is included in the household. So if the priest has a slave, that slave is included in the household, and anybody who is born to that slave is also included. So they can eat the holy things as well. But it also points out, if the priest's daughter this is where it gets a little confusing. What if a priest's daughter gets married to someone who is not a priest? Does she still eat the holy things? And the answer is no. But but if her husband dies and she returns to the priest's house, then she can eat the holy things again because she's part of the household again. It's interesting, to say the least. But these holy things were not allowed to be eaten by just anyone. They were only allowed to be eaten by the priests and the household of the priests. And verses 17 through 33, this is where we're going to end our text for tonight, talks about what makes an acceptable offering. And essentially, the only offerings that were acceptable to God were to be as pure, as holy, and as without blemish as possible. Of course, there were particular animals that were designated to be the offerings, like bulls and sheep and goats and turtle doves or pigeons, and only particular ones of those, a male of those that was a year old and was without spot or blemish. And blemish, like we've seen with the constraints put on priests who can be a high priest, blemish doesn't just include like something on the skin. It also includes something like disease or blindness or deformity. So essentially, it cannot be a kind of animal that you would just rather get rid of, is the point. It has to be an animal that you would have wanted to keep. This is a good sheep. This is like your best sheep. But it is the one that is the only kind that would be an acceptable sacrifice. And so when you give up that good sheep, you are giving up something that you would rather want to keep for yourself. God's altar isn't a trash dump. And this is what the book of Malachi, we looked at that just a couple of weeks ago. That's what the book of Malachi addresses. They were bringing in lame and sick and deformed offerings to God as if it was acceptable. They were treating the altar of God like a trash dump. And God says that is way out of line. You cannot do that. God demands the best because the best is something that you would rather have kept for yourself. And that is the whole point. You don't keep it for yourself. You give it up to God. Verses 31 through 33 points out that just as God sanctified Israel, Israel was to sanctify God. You shall keep my commandments and do them. I am the Lord. And you will not profane my holy name, that I may be sanctified among the people of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord. So the principle is, just as God sanctified Israel, Israel was to sanctify God. Now, this is all well and good, talking about the priesthood, the certain things that went along with that, constraints put on them. Cool little study, but let's bring it on home. You ready? This is going to maybe blow your mind. Peter calls us Christians priests. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9, if you want to look at that, this is what it says. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, and a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of the darkness and into his marvelous light. We are God's priests in the new covenant. There were the priests in the old covenant, right? The Levitical priesthood. But what about the new one? It's called the new covenant. We need a priesthood. God makes Christians those priests. He made Jesus our high priest. We're going to see that in a little bit. Or we won't, but you can read that in Hebrews, yeah. But what about the other priests, the not high priests, the normal priests? We are. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 points out that we are called to a greater purity as we are the temple of the Spirit. 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 19 through 20. He says, "Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God in your body. You are not your own, you were bought with a price. We're the temple of the Spirit, and therefore, if you know the context of what he's talking about, we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard of purity than the rest of the world does. And that is really big, and it's something that a lot of people struggle with, grappling with the fact that they need to do that. Again, also there's the idea of the fact that as God sanctified us, he made us the Spirit, or the Spirit's temple, and he put the Spirit in us. Therefore, he has sanctified us, and he bought us. We must sanctify him in return. Not that we make God holy, but we treat him as holy. We don't treat him so casually as to, bring anything less than our best to him, or to bring something before him that he has not authorized. We treat him as holy. Again, Peter points this out too in 1 Peter chapter 1. We'll see verses 14 through 19. As obedient children, don't be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all of your conduct. Since it's written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on him as Father who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways you inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without spot or blemish. Peter points out that we were bought, we were redeemed with the blood of Christ. And as he is holy, the one who has redeemed us, we also must be holy. There's also the added reason that he judges everyone impartially for the deeds that they do in this life. So we need to conduct ourselves with fear, with reverence, with respect for God throughout our time here. Paul also calls our attention to making sure that our offerings that we bring to God are acceptable to God. If you look in Romans chapter 12, starting in verse 1, he says, I appeal to you, therefore, my brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. How do we make sure that we're holy and acceptable to God? He says, don't be conformed to this world. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. We have to make sure that our spiritual service, which is to give present ourselves as living sacrifices, is in an acceptable manner. And how do we do that? We allow our minds to be renewed. How do we do that? Well, of course, by understanding, learning what the will of God is, so that we can discern what is good and acceptable and perfect. That's our responsibility, to know better. And in 1 Corinthians 11, he says in verse 27, this is in the context of the Lord's Supper, whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judged ourselves truly, we would not be judged. We would not be condemned, is what he's meaning. But when we are judged by the Lord, we are disciplined, so that we may not be condemned along with the world. What's he saying? He says when we come together and we partake of the Lord's Supper, we need to be examining ourselves. We need to be making sure that our offering of worship at that moment is acceptable to God. And it would not be acceptable if we are not discerning the body when we are partaking of the body and the blood of Christ. You know, we are not so disconnected from this matter of the priesthood. We are the new priesthood. You know, we're not so disconnected from it as people would make it out to be. You know, they say that's the Old Testament. We don't need to study the Old Testament. We don't need to understand these things because they don't apply to us. But these things do connect to us. We are the new priesthood. We're brought about at the sense of at the cessation of the old priesthood. If you look in Hebrews chapter 8 talks about the fact that the old priesthood was brought to an end. The old covenant was brought to an end. That is, Hebrews chapter 8, verses 8 through 13 says, he finds fault with them when he says, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, that when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand and brought them out of the land of Egypt, because they didn't continue in my covenant. And so I showed them no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, declares the Lord, I will put my laws into their hearts and write them on their hearts. Into their minds, and write them on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they will be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all already know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquity, and I will remember their sins no more. Verse 13, in speaking of a new covenant, he renders the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete is growing old and is ready to vanish away. The Old and New Testaments are not completely disconnected as some would portray, but they are a continuation. The New is a continuation of the plan of God to redeem humanity. They're not a continuation in the matter of law, like we're supposed to follow the laws of the Old Testament, but they are a continuation of God's plan and God's will and God's values that are expressed. And so when we happen upon these values of, God's priests are supposed to maintain their purity, and they're supposed to respect God's holiness, and they're supposed to pay attention that the sacrifices are acceptable to God as per the measurement that he gave. Those principles still apply. They're in a very different way. We don't offer goats and bulls and turtle doves, but we offer our spiritual worship. We offer ourselves as living sacrifices. And if we are living sacrifices, we're offerings, then we need to make sure that we are without spot and without blemish. Because you don't bring God anything less than your best. That's it for tonight. I got 30 seconds. So that's it for tonight. I hope that Sunday morning you will tune in. Last Sunday morning, apparently no one could see the video that I put up on Facebook. I don't know what Facebook has against videos, so I'm going to make sure to do it live and to do the sermon live. And I hope that, I pray that no one will let the fact that we are kind of all separated get in the way of devoting time tomorrow to God, to worshiping God, and to singing praises to His name, and to partake of the Lord's Supper along with the members of your household. So I will see you then. Have a good night, everybody.